On the evening of August 2008, the eyes of the world were fixed on a breathtaking spectacle in Beijing. As thousands of drummers pounded in perfect unison to open the Summer Olympics, global leaders sat shoulder to shoulder in the VIP stands, smiling, shaking hands, and celebrating what felt like the pinnacle of a newly interconnected, peaceful world order. It was a moment of supreme geopolitical illusion. While fireworks painted the sky over the Bird's Nest Stadium, more than 4,000 miles away, real artillery shells were tearing the night apart across the rugged slopes of the Caucasus Mountains. The post-Cold War era of undisputed Western dominance was not just ending, it was being violently dismantled. At the center of this shattering reality was a small, ancient nation the size of South Carolina and its president, a man whose towering ambition and fatal miscalculations had just triggered the first massive Russian military intervention outside its borders since the collapse of the Soviet Union. His name was Mikhail Saakashvili, and he had just made a gamble that would redefine the global balance of power for the rest of the 21st century. To understand how a tiny republic dared to challenge a nuclear superpower, and why the events of those 5 days in August serve as the direct, blood-soaked prologue to the modern tragedies of Crimea and Ukraine, we must wind the clock back to a time of extraordinary optimism. We must go back to a moment when it seemed that the sheer force of a charismatic leader's will could literally pull a nation out of the Russian orbit and anchor it forever to the West. The story of the man who defied Moscow truly begins in November 2003, during what the world would come to know as the Rose Revolution. At that time, the Republic of Georgia was a failing state. Crushed between the Black Sea and the towering peaks of the Greater Caucasus, it was a country rich in history and culture, but paralyzed by deep systemic rot. Following its independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, Georgia had spiraled into civil war, ethnic conflict, and staggering economic collapse. By the early 2000s, it was governed by Eduard Shevardnadze, a former Soviet foreign minister whose regime had calcified into a syndicate of breathtaking corruption. Citizens lived without reliable electricity or running water, pensions went unpaid for months, and the police force was little more than a state-sanctioned mafia extorting the public. Into this landscape of despair stepped a 35-year-old lawyer named Mikhail Saakashvili. He was everything the old Soviet Guard was not. Educated at Columbia University and George Washington University, Saakashvili spoke flawless English, radiated boundless, almost manic energy, and possessed a preternatural gift for political theater. When parliamentary elections in late 2003 were blatantly rigged by the ruling party, Saakashvili did not just protest, he mobilized the entire nation. In a moment that would be broadcast around the globe, he led thousands of unarmed citizens to the parliament building in the capital city of Tbilisi. Holding a single red rose to signify peaceful intentions, he burst through the doors of the legislative chamber, interrupting the opening session and forcing the bewildered president to flee out the back door. It was a bloodless, triumphant coup. It was the ultimate triumph of democratic idealism, and the Western world fell instantly, deeply in love with him. Upon assuming the presidency in 2004, Saakashvili unleashed a tidal wave of reforms that shocked the post-Soviet space. He was a man in a desperate hurry, driven by a profound, almost messianic conviction that his historic destiny was to permanently sever Georgia's ties with its imperial Russian past and integrate it into the Euro-Atlantic community. His methods were draconian but fiercely effective. In a single day, he fired the entire National Traffic Police force, 30,000 officers, to eradicate their culture of bribery, replacing them months later with a modern, Western-trained patrol force. He deregulated the economy, slashed taxes, and opened the country to foreign investment. Within just a few years, Georgia transformed from a dark, corrupt backwater into one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. The World Bank named it the #1 economic reformer globally. New skyscrapers began to alter the skyline of Tbilisi. Glass-walled police stations were built to symbolize transparency, and the country's infrastructure was rapidly modernized. But Saakashvili's ambitions extended far beyond domestic reform. He wanted absolute security for his nation, and in his mind, that meant only one thing: membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and integration into the European Union. He actively courted Western leaders, sending Georgian troops to fight alongside American troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, ultimately becoming the largest per capita non-NATO contributor to the coalition forces. The administration of United States President George W. Bush was captivated by this narrative. When Bush visited Tbilisi in 2005, addressing a massive cheering crowd in Freedom Square, he famously declared Georgia a beacon of liberty for the region and the world. For Saakashvili, this was intoxicating. Surrounded by American advisors, draped in the flag of Western approval, and celebrated by the international media, he began to believe in a dangerous premise: that his relationship with Washington was a shield made of iron. He began to believe that the West would never allow this shining beacon of democracy to be extinguished. However, a few hundred miles to the north, watching this blossoming romance between Tbilisi and Washington, was a man who harbored a very different view of history. Vladimir Putin had recently consolidated his own power in Russia, pulling his country out of the chaos and humiliation of the 1990s. For Putin, the collapse of the Soviet Union was not a liberation, but the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He viewed the expansion of Western influence into the former Soviet regions not as the spread of democracy, but a direct, existential encroachment on Russia's historic sphere of influence, its indispensable buffer zones, and its fundamental security. To Moscow, the Caucasus Mountains were the soft southern underbelly of the Russian Federation. The idea of NATO, a hostile military alliance originally designed to destroy the Soviet Union, parking its tanks and missiles in Georgia, right on Russia's doorstep, was absolutely unacceptable. It was an absolute red line. But the friction between Moscow and Tbilisi was not merely about hypothetical NATO membership. It was rooted in the very geography of Georgia itself. When Georgia broke away from the Soviet Union in 1991, two of its regions, Abkhazia, located on the Black Sea coast, and South Ossetia, a mountainous enclave in the north, sought their own independence from Tbilisi. Brutal, ethnically fueled civil wars erupted in the early 1990s. The Georgian military was defeated, largely due to clandestine military support provided to the separatists by the Russian military. The conflicts ended in fragile ceasefires, leaving Abkhazia and South Ossetia as frozen, de facto independent statelets within Georgia's internationally recognized borders. For more than a decade, these regions existed as frozen conflicts, but they were not simply dormant war zones. They were geopolitical levers expertly manipulated by Moscow. Russia maintained a presence in both regions under the guise of the Commonwealth of Independent States peacekeeping forces. More insidiously, over the years, Moscow engaged in a deliberate strategy known as passportization. The Russian government began systematically handing out Russian passports to the residents of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. It was a brilliant, cynical mechanism of hybrid warfare long before the term became popular. By turning the residents of these breakaway regions into Russian citizens, Moscow manufactured a legal pretext for future intervention. If Georgia ever tried to reclaim its sovereign territory by force, Russia could claim it was not invading a neighbor, but simply fulfilling its constitutional duty to protect the lives of Russian citizens abroad. But Mikhail Saakashvili was not a man inclined to accept the status quo. Early in his presidency, he successfully and peacefully managed to bring another rebellious region, Adjara, back under central government.
The turning point, the moment the fuse was truly lit, occurred in April 2008 at the NATO summit in Bucharest, Romania. This event remains one of the most consequential and disastrous diplomatic gatherings in modern history. President Bush arrived in Bucharest determined to grant Georgia and Ukraine a Membership Action Plan, or MAP, which is the official formalized stepping stone to full NATO membership and the mutual defense guarantees of Article 5. But European powers, led by German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Nicolas Sarkozy, vehemently opposed the move. They recognized that bringing former Soviet states into the alliance would severely antagonize a resurgent Russia, upon whose cheap natural gas the European economy relied. The resulting compromise was the worst of all possible worlds. The alliance denied Georgia and Ukraine the Membership Action Plan, denying them any immediate institutional protection. However, in a vaguely worded final communiqué designed to save face, NATO declared that these countries will become members of NATO at some unspecified point in the future. For Saakashvili, it was a bitter disappointment, but he spun it as a long-term victory. For Vladimir Putin, it was a flashing red alarm and an invitation. The Bucharest Declaration signaled to Moscow that Georgia would eventually join a hostile military alliance, but importantly, it confirmed that right now, in the present moment, Georgia was entirely unprotected. They had painted a target on Saakashvili's back, but refused to give him armor. The window of opportunity for Russia to act, to permanently cripple Georgia and shatter its NATO dreams by ensuring it remained entangled in territorial disputes, was suddenly wide open. The clock was now ticking, and Moscow began preparing for war. Following the Bucharest summit, the spring and summer of 2008 saw a masterclass in Russian escalation and provocation. Moscow unilaterally lifted economic sanctions on the separatist regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, establishing direct legal ties with their unrecognized governments. Russian railway troops, military engineering units, were dispatched into Abkhazia under the pretext of repairing tracks, but in reality they were establishing the logistical supply lines necessary for a rapid armored invasion. In the skies over Georgia, unidentified jets and unmanned aerial vehicles began violating Georgian airspace. In one famous incident, a Russian MiG-29 fighter jet shot down a Georgian unarmed drone over Abkhazia. The event was captured on the drone's own camera before it was destroyed, yet Moscow flatly denied any involvement, practicing the art of plausible deniability that would later become a hallmark of their operations in Eastern Europe. But it was in the small mountainous enclave of South Ossetia where the pressure cooker was truly set to explode.
The line of contact between Georgian villages and South Ossetian separatist forces was a jagged, deeply interwoven patchwork. As July turned into August, the fragile ceasefire that had held for over a decade began to violently unravel. Sniper fire became a nightly occurrence. Landmines inexplicably blew up Georgian police vehicles. Artillery shells launched by separatist militias began slamming into ethnic Georgian villages located inside the conflict zone. Saakashvili was caught in a brilliantly laid trap. He was a leader whose entire political brand was built on strength, national pride, and the promise of territorial integrity. The separatists, clearly emboldened and directed by their Russian handlers, were baiting him. If Saakashvili ordered his military to stand down and absorb the casualties, he would look incredibly weak to his own people. The opposition in Tbilisi, already restless, might overthrow him. But if he ordered his military to strike back with overwhelming force, he would give Russia the exact excuse it needed to launch a full-scale invasion to protect its passport-holding citizens. Behind closed doors, the diplomatic cables were burning up. Senior American officials, including Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, visited Tbilisi and explicitly warned Saakashvili not to take the bait. The message from Washington was stark: do not engage. If you get into a shooting war with Russia, the United States military will not come to save you. We will not start World War III over South Ossetia. Saakashvili heard the words, but it is deeply debatable whether he truly believed them. Driven by a combination of profound national pride, tremendous domestic pressure, and an arguably delusional faith in his own international leverage, he believed he could thread the needle. He calculated that if he moved swiftly enough, he could execute a localized, lightning-fast military operation to neutralize the separatist artillery and establish control over Tskhinvali, the South Ossetian capital. It was a colossal misjudgment of his adversary. As the first week of August progressed, the situation on the ground deteriorated into a slow-motion catastrophe. By August 1st, intensive exchanges of fire leaving dead and wounded on both sides. Recognizing what was coming, the South Ossetian separatist government began a mass evacuation of civilians. Convoys of buses carried thousands of women, children, and the elderly north, across the border into the Russian Federation. To any seasoned military observer, this was a chilling indicator. You do not evacuate cities unless you are clearing the battlefield for heavy combat. Concurrently, Georgian intelligence was picking up terrifying intercepts. They reported that elements of the 58th Army, a battle-hardened force that had fought in Chechnya, were massing on the northern side of the Caucasus Mountains. The only way for a Russian invasion force to enter South Ossetia was through the Roki Tunnel, a narrow 2-mile-long tube bored directly through the solid rock of the Greater Caucasus. Whoever controlled the Roki Tunnel controlled the destiny of the region. The psychological tension inside the presidential palace in Tbilisi was suffocating. Mikhail Saakashvili was sleeping only in fits and starts, surrounded by military commanders bringing him increasingly dire reports. By August 6th, the separatist artillery barrages had escalated significantly. Georgian peacekeepers were being killed. Civilians in Georgian villages were cowering in basements as mortar shells rained down. Saakashvili ordered Georgian armored columns to move toward the administrative boundary line, hoping a show of force would deter further attacks. It did not. On the afternoon of August 7th, Saakashvili appeared on national television, desperately calling for an immediate, unilateral ceasefire. He offered sweeping autonomy to South Ossetia, promising that the Georgian government would forgive all previous transgressions if they would only stop firing. He ordered his troops to hold their fire, even if fired upon. For a few agonizing hours, there was silence.
But as darkness fell over the Caucasus on the night of August 7th, the separatist forces unleashed their heaviest bombardment yet, targeting a constellation of ethnic Georgian villages. The casualties were mounting. In his war room, Saakashvili was told by his intelligence chiefs that not only were the separatists trying to wipe out the Georgian enclaves, but that heavy Russian armor had already begun moving through the Roki Tunnel, entering sovereign Georgian territory. The moment of supreme crisis had arrived. Saakashvili faced an agonizing, historically fatal dilemma. Should he wait for the international community to wake up and issue strongly worded condemnations while his citizens were slaughtered and his country was quietly occupied? Or should he use his American-trained, newly equipped military to preempt the Russian advance, seize the Roki Tunnel, and defend his nation's sovereignty? In the early, suffocatingly tense hours of the night, driven by a volatile mix of desperation, duty, and hubris, the president of Georgia made his choice. He decided to roll the iron dice. He gave the order to the Georgian armed forces to commence a massive military operation to restore constitutional order in South Ossetia. At 11:35 p.m. on August 7th, the night sky over the conflict zone erupted. Georgian multiple rocket launchers unleashed a devastating barrage against separatist positions in and around Skinvali. The earth shook as heavy artillery pounded the rugged terrain. Shortly after, columns of Georgian infantry and armor surged forward, crossing into the breakaway territory. The Georgian offensive was swift and initially fiercely effective. By the morning of August 8th, as the world was just waking up to the news of the Olympic opening ceremonies, Georgian troops were fighting their way into the streets of Skinvali. The separatist resistance seemed to be crumbling. In Tbilisi, there was a fleeting, dangerous moment of euphoria. Saakashvili and his inner circle believed for just a few hours that their massive gamble had paid off. They believed they had caught the Russian bear hibernating, that they had secured their territory, and that they had permanently altered the destiny of their nation. But the euphoria was an illusion, built on a catastrophic failure of intelligence and a profound misunderstanding of their enemy's ruthless preparation. Saakashvili believed he was racing to seal the gates before the Russians could arrive. He did not realize the gates had been open for days. Deep in the dark subterranean depths of the Roki Tunnel, the earth was vibrating not from Georgian artillery, but from the treads of hundreds of Russian tanks, armored personnel carriers, and self-propelled howitzers. The Russian 58th Army was not mobilizing in response to the Georgian attack. They were already moving. The trap had been perfectly executed, the bait had been taken, and as Georgian troops pushed deeper into the South Ossetian capital, looking up at the sky, the true terrifying scale of Moscow's response was about to descend upon them. As the dawn of August 8, 2008 broke over the jagged peaks of the Caucasus Mountains, the brief, intoxicating illusion of a Georgian victory was shattered not by the sound of returning artillery, but by a deafening roar descending from the sky. Georgian soldiers who had spent the night fighting their way into the burning streets of the South Ossetian capital, Skinvali, looked up to see a nightmare materializing above them. Squadrons of Russian Sukhoi Su-25 ground attack jets and Tupolev Tu-22M strategic bombers began tearing through the Georgian airspace, unleashing a relentless torrent of precision-guided munitions and unguided cluster bombs.
But the horror for the Georgian command was not merely that the Russian Air Force had arrived, it was where they were striking. The bombs were not just falling on the immediate battlefield in South Ossetia. Far beyond the conflict zone, deep inside undisputed, sovereign Georgian territory, military bases, radar installations, and crucial infrastructure were being systematically pulverized. The Vatsiani military base near the capital, the Marneoli air base, and the vital Black Sea port of Poti were engulfed in flames. In a matter of hours, the Georgian military command realized with chilling clarity that this was not a localized skirmish to push them out of a separatist enclave. This was a full-scale, devastatingly coordinated invasion designed to break the back of the entire Georgian state. While the skies rained fire, the situation on the ground rapidly transformed into an overwhelming mechanized avalanche. Through the narrow, suffocating darkness of the 2-mile-long Roki Tunnel, the only geographical artery connecting Russia to South Ossetia, the Russian 58th Army poured relentlessly into Georgian territory. Hundreds of T-72 tanks, armored personnel carriers, and self-propelled howitzers flooded the valleys, commanded by seasoned Russian generals who had spent the last decade fighting brutal, unforgiving wars in Chechnya. Mikhail Saakashvili had calculated that he could race against time, secure the territory, and present the world with a frozen reality before Moscow could mobilize, but he had walked blindly into a meticulously prepared snare. The Russian military had not mobilized in response to the Georgian attack. They had been waiting at the border, their engines idling, their logistics in place, waiting for the young, impulsive Georgian president to make the first move. And now that he had, Moscow possessed the ultimate geopolitical cover. They were not invaders, the Kremlin declared to the world. They were peacekeepers, executing a mission of peace enforcement to stop a genocide against Russian citizens. The bizarre, surreal juxtaposition of this violence against the backdrop of global diplomacy played out in real time thousands of miles away in Beijing. As the Olympic Games commenced, President George W. Bush sat in the VIP stands just a few seats away from Vladimir Putin, who was then serving as Russia's prime minister, but universally understood to be the ultimate wielder of Russian power. When the news of the escalating war reached the stadium, Bush reportedly leaned over to confront Putin, warning him that this escalation was unacceptable. Putin's response was ice-cold and thoroughly calculated. He looked at the American president and stated that volunteers were gathering in Russia to fight the Georgian aggression and that it was very difficult to hold them back. It was a masterclass in the cynical, plausible deniability that would become the hallmark of Russian foreign policy for the next 2 decades. In that brief exchange in a stadium filled with cheering crowds, the post-Cold War world order was quietly but violently fracturing.
Back in Tbilisi, Mikhail Saakashvili was experiencing the terrifying collapse of his grandest assumptions. But the kinetic bombardment by jets and artillery was only half of the war being waged against him. As the Russian tanks rolled south, a completely new, invisible front was opened, marking a chilling milestone in the history of human conflict. For the first time ever, a massive, coordinated cyber warfare campaign was synchronized perfectly with a conventional military invasion. Before the first Russian tank even crossed the border, the Georgian digital infrastructure began to collapse.
mysterious networks of hackers operating under the guise of patriotic Russian civilian volunteers, but widely understood to be directed by Russian intelligence services, launched crippling distributed denial-of-service attacks against the Georgian internet. Government websites, including the president's own official page, were defaced or knocked entirely offline. The servers of major Georgian banks crashed, freezing financial transactions and spreading panic among civilians trying to access their savings. National media outlets were silenced, cutting off the government's ability to communicate with its own people. In an era where information is as vital as ammunition, Georgia was plunged into digital darkness. This cyber blitzkrieg induced a profound psychological paralysis across the country, amplifying the terror of the physical bombings and perfectly demonstrating how warfare in the 21st century would no longer be confined to the physical battlefield. By August 9th, the second day of the war, the strategic reality for the Georgian armed forces had become apocalyptic. The Georgian military, while recently modernized and equipped with NATO standard gear, had been fundamentally trained by American advisors for counterinsurgency operations. They were prepared to patrol the dusty streets of Baghdad and Kabul, hunting insurgents alongside coalition forces. They were absolutely not prepared, nor were they equipped to fight a massive, conventional, mechanized land war against a nuclear superpower. As the Russian forces advanced, the Georgian lines around Tsinvali began to disintegrate. Communication between Georgian frontline commanders and the general staff in Tbilisi broke down. Units found themselves isolated, outgunned, and rapidly running out of ammunition. Recognizing the imminent threat of total annihilation, the Georgian command ordered a general retreat. But the withdrawal quickly turned into a chaotic, desperate rout. The highway connecting Tsinvali to the undisputed Georgian city of Gori became a gauntlet of death, with retreating Georgian columns relentlessly strafed by Russian aviation. In the presidential palace, the atmosphere was one of suffocating dread. Saakashvili, operating on zero sleep and immense adrenaline, was working the telephones with frantic desperation. He was calling every Western capital, begging for diplomatic intervention, demanding military assistance, and pleading for the West to honor the democratic values it had so loudly praised his country for upholding. He spoke with U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and European leaders, trying to convince them that the Russian tanks rolling into Georgia were not just coming for him, but were rolling over the very concept of a free Europe. He argued passionately that if the West did not stop Russia here in the Caucasus, the Kremlin would not stop, and the borders of Europe would eventually be redrawn by force. It was a prophetic warning, one that the world would tragically ignore until the annexation of Crimea 6 years later. But in those suffocating days of August, Saakashvili learned the most brutal lesson of geopolitics. He learned the difference between being an ally and being a strategic priority. The American response was deeply sympathetic, but militarily sterile. The United States military did intervene in one specific way. They utilized military transport aircraft to airlift the roughly 2,000 Georgian troops who were deployed in Iraq back to Tbilisi. But the message from the White House was absolute and uncompromising. American soldiers would not fight Russian soldiers. The United States would not risk a global thermonuclear war over the geopolitical status of South Ossetia. The NATO alliance, which had promised Georgia eventual membership just 4 months prior, stood completely paralyzed. The grand declarations of support, the speeches about a beacon of liberty, the shared democratic values, none of it amounted to a shield against a Russian tank. Georgia was alone. This crushing isolation began to take a visible, profound psychological toll on the Georgian leadership. The pressure cooker of those 5 days produced one of the most infamous and enduring images of modern political history. During a live television broadcast, while supposedly off-air but still being recorded by a BDC camera, Mikhail Saakashvili was caught in a moment of sheer, unadulterated panic. Sitting at his desk, frantically listening to a telephone receiver, his eyes darting with anxiety, the president of Georgia nervously grabbed the end of his red necktie, shoved it into his mouth, and began to chew on it frantically. When the footage leaked and subsequently broadcast on an endless loop by Russian state television, it became a devastating weapon of psychological warfare. To his supporters, it was a deeply human moment of a man watching his country be destroyed. To his detractors and to the Kremlin, it was the ultimate proof that the man who had dared to challenge Moscow was not a brave statesman, but an erratic, cowardly puppet collapsing under the weight of his own hubris. By August 10th, the Russian military machine expanded the conflict even further, opening a devastating second front. In the western breakaway region of Abkhazia, thousands of additional Russian troops, supported by amphibious landings from the Russian Black Sea Fleet, poured into the strategically vital Kodori Gorge, pushing Georgian forces out of the last piece of Abkhaz territory they controlled. The Russian Navy established a total blockade of the Georgian coastline, sinking Georgian Coast Guard vessels in the port of Poti and severing the country's maritime supply lines. Georgia was now completely enveloped, bleeding from multiple fronts, its airspace dominated, its coastline choked, and its digital infrastructure in ruins. Then came the darkest day of the war. On August 11th, the unthinkable happened. The Russian armed forces did not stop at the borders of the separatist regions. Having completely expelled Georgian forces from South Ossetia and Abkhazia, the Russian armored columns crossed the administrative boundary lines and pushed deep into undisputed sovereign Georgian territory. They captured the city of Zugdi in the west. More terrifyingly, the Russian military captured the city of Gori in the center of the country. Gori sits squarely on the main east-west highway that connects the two halves of Georgia. By taking Gori, the Russian military effectively cut the country in two, paralyzing all internal movement and supply. But the capture of Gori signified something far more terrifying. The city sits only 40 miles from the capital, Tbilisi. There were no natural geographic barriers left between the Russian vanguard and the seat of the Georgian government, and the Georgian military was completely incapable of mounting a defense of the capital. Panic swept through the streets of Tbilisi. Tens of thousands of civilians, terrified by the rumors of approaching Russian tanks, clogged the roads heading south towards the Armenian border. People swarmed supermarkets, hoarding bread, water, and essential supplies. The sky over the capital was ominously quiet, save for the occasional roar of a Russian jet passing unchallenged overhead. In the presidential bunker, the conversation shifted from how to win the war to how to ensure the physical survival of the Georgian state and its leadership. The specter of regime change hung heavy in the air. Saakashvili and his ministers fully expected Russian special forces to storm the capital, arrest the government, and install a pro-Moscow.
The international community, jolted out of its Olympic reverie by the sheer speed and brutality of the Russian advance, scrambled to intervene before the Georgian state was completely dismantled. French President Nicolas Sarkozy, whose country held the rotating presidency of the European Union, appointed himself as the chief mediator. In a whirlwind of frantic, high-stakes shuttle diplomacy, Sarkozy flew first to Moscow to meet with Russian President Dmitry Medvedev and Prime Minister Vladimir Putin. The negotiations in the Kremlin were reportedly extraordinarily tense and hostile. Putin was furious, smelling blood in the water. According to diplomatic leaks that would surface years later, Putin used incredibly graphic, violent language when discussing Saakashvili with the French president, expressing a desire to see the Georgian leader physically humiliated and destroyed. Sarkozy, representing the collective panic of the European continent, pleaded with the Russian leadership to halt their advance, warning them that marching on Tbilisi would cross an unforgivable line and isolate Russia from the global economy. Sarkozy managed to hammer out a fragile, hastily drafted 6-point ceasefire plan. The plan called for an immediate cessation of hostilities, free access for humanitarian aid, and crucially, the return of Georgian and Russian armed forces to the positions they held prior to the outbreak of the war. With the document in hand, Sarkozy immediately flew to Tbilisi to present the terms to a desperate Saakashvili. The meeting in the Georgian capital was an agonizing exercise in accepting defeat. Saakashvili looked at the document and knew it was deeply flawed. The phrasing regarding the positioning of Russian troops was dangerously ambiguous, leaving loopholes that Moscow could exploit. Furthermore, the document entirely failed to guarantee Georgia's territorial integrity, a glaring omission that essentially cemented Russia's military gains. But Sarkozy looked the Georgian president in the eye and delivered a harsh ultimatum. Sign this paper, or the Russian tanks, which are currently idling just a short drive down the highway, will be in this courtyard tomorrow morning, and nobody in the world will come to stop them. Faced with the imminent annihilation of his country and his own potential demise, Saakashvili yielded. On the night of August 12th, just 5 days after the first artillery shells had illuminated the sky over Tskin Valley, he signed the ceasefire agreement. The 5-day war, one of the shortest but most consequential conflicts of the modern era, was officially over. But the cessation of kinetic violence did not mean peace. It simply meant that the battlefield had shifted from the rugged mountains of the Caucasus to the treacherous, shadowy halls of international diplomacy. As the ink dried on the 6-point plan, an eerie, suffocating tension settled over Georgia. The guns had largely fallen silent, but the reality on the ground was terrifying. Despite the terms of the agreement, the Russian army did not immediately withdraw. Their tanks remained parked on the main highway outside Gori, their gun barrels pointed toward Tbilisi. Russian soldiers continued to man checkpoints deep inside sovereign Georgian territory, casually inspecting the passports of terrified Georgian civilians. The airspace was still under Moscow's total control. To the world watching on television, it appeared a diplomatic resolution had been achieved. But to the people of Georgia and to Mikhail Saakashvili looking out from his beleaguered capital, the nightmare was far from over. The superpower had stopped its march, but its boot was still firmly planted on the throat of the nation. The ultimate question remained unanswered, hanging in the air like a delayed explosive. Would Vladimir Putin honor the paper signed by the French president, or was this ceasefire merely a pause for breath before the Russian bear finally crushed the life out of the man who had dared to defy it? The agonizing suspense that gripped Tbilisi in the days following the August 12 ceasefire was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev had agreed to halt the military advance, but the Russian war machine did not simply pack up and leave. Instead, Moscow deliberately dragged its feet, engaging in a slow, menacing, and deeply humiliating withdrawal. Russian troops lingered in the undisputed Georgian territories, establishing checkpoints, dismantling Georgian military bases piece by piece, and carrying off everything from advanced American-supplied communication gear to the very toilets from the barracks. For 2 excruciating weeks, the Georgian people lived with the constant, terrifying realization that their national survival depended entirely on the whims of the Kremlin. But while the physical threat to the Georgian capital slowly receded, the true geopolitical death blow was delivered not with artillery, but with a pen. On August 26, 2008, the Russian government officially recognized South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent sovereign states. This was the crossing of a historical Rubicon.
By legally recognizing the breakaway regions, Russia effectively redrew the sovereign borders of a neighboring country by military force for the first time since the end of the Second World War. Moscow announced that it would establish permanent military bases in both territories, effectively annexing 20% of Georgia's internationally recognized landmass. The trap that Mikhail Saakashvili had walked into was now fully sprung, and the jaws had snapped shut permanently. Georgia's dream of joining NATO was effectively dead. The alliance, built on the principle of collective defense, would never admit a country with actively disputed borders and thousands of hostile Russian troops stationed within its internationally recognized territory. In just 5 days of combat, Russia had not only dismantled the Georgian military, it had fundamentally vetoed the eastward expansion of the Western security architecture. As the dust settled and the world tried to make sense of the catastrophe, a bitter, highly contested battle over the narrative began. Who was truly to blame for this devastating eruption of violence? To answer this, the European Union commissioned an independent, exhaustive fact-finding mission led by the veteran Swiss diplomat Heidi Tagliavini. When the Tagliavini report was finally published in late 2009, it delivered a nuanced, incredibly uncomfortable truth that pleased absolutely no one. The report categorically concluded that it was, in fact, the Georgian military that had initiated the large-scale hostilities on the night of August 7 with its heavy artillery bombardment of Tskhin. This finding shattered Saakashvili's narrative that he was purely the victim of a sudden, unprovoked Russian surprise attack. The report confirmed what many international observers had feared. The young, impulsive Georgian president had fundamentally lost his nerve and fired the first shots. However, the report was equally damning of Moscow. It explicitly detailed how the Georgian assault was the culmination of months, if not years, of calculated, escalating provocations by Russian-backed separatists and Russian forces themselves. The investigation denounced Russia's massive, systematic distribution of passports to the residents of the breakaway regions as an illegal, premeditated violation of international law designed solely to manufacture a pretext for war. Furthermore, it declared that Russia's military response, bombing civilian infrastructure deep inside Georgia, launching cyber attacks, and opening a second front in Abkhazia, was vastly disproportionate and a blatant violation of the United Nations Charter. The August War was ultimately a tragedy of shared culpability. It was the disastrous collision of Georgian hubris and Russian imperialism. Saakashvili had undoubtedly lit the match, but Vladimir Putin had spent the better part of a decade meticulously soaking the house in gasoline, just waiting for the spark.
Yet, the most profound and catastrophic failure in the aftermath of the 5-day war was not found in the pages of diplomatic reports, but in the corridors of Western power. The international response to Russia's brazen dismemberment of a sovereign state was shockingly, tragically hollow. In the immediate aftermath, there were strong condemnations, suspended diplomatic dialogues, and angry speeches at the United Nations. But almost immediately, the gears of global pragmatism began to turn, grinding Georgia's tragedy into a forgotten footnote. Just weeks after the ceasefire, the global financial system imploded with the collapse of Lehman Brothers. Suddenly, Western capitals were consumed by the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. The appetite for a prolonged, painful geopolitical standoff with a nuclear-armed, energy-exporting Russia simply vanished. The turning point of Western appeasement arrived just a few months later, in early 2009, with the inauguration of a new American president, Barack Obama. The new administration arrived in Washington eager to distance itself from the foreign policy of George W. Bush, which they viewed as overly aggressive and deeply entangled in the Middle East. Seeking diplomatic victories and cooperation on arms control and the war in Afghanistan, the Obama administration decided to wipe the slate clean with Moscow. In a moment that would age with horrifying irony, U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton presented Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov with a literal red plastic button labeled Reset. Due to a translation error, the Russian word printed on the button actually meant overcharge, a linguistic mistake that perfectly foreshadowed the disaster to come. By hitting the reset button so soon after the invasion of Georgia, the United States and its European allies sent a crystal clear, unmistakable message to Vladimir Putin.
The West values economic stability and diplomatic convenience far more than it values the territorial integrity of former Soviet republics. The West demonstrated that there would be no long-term consequences for military aggression. No crippling sanctions were imposed. No permanent isolation was enforced. Russia was welcomed back into the G8, and European nations continued to sign massive contracts for cheap Russian natural gas. Vladimir Putin is a student of history and a master of calculating weakness. He watched the Western reaction to the 5-day war, and he learned the ultimate strategic lesson. He learned that the North Atlantic Alliance was highly risk-averse. He learned that the threat of a wider conflict would cause the West to instinctively back down. And most dangerously, he learned that the blueprint executed in Georgia, utilizing proxy separatists, weaponizing citizenship through passportization, combining cyber warfare with conventional force, and hiding behind the rhetoric of protecting ethnic minorities, worked flawlessly. The August War was not an anomaly. It was a successful beta test for the dark future of Eastern Europe. While the world eagerly moved on, the man who had dared to defy Moscow began a long, agonizing descent into political and personal tragedy. Mikhail Saakashvili survived the war physically, and for a few years he managed to maintain his grip on power, continuing his domestic reforms and rebuilding his shattered country's infrastructure with billions of dollars in Western aid. But his aura of invincibility was irrevocably broken. The Georgian people, traumatized by the war and increasingly exhausted by his authoritarian tendencies and harsh police tactics, began to turn against him. In the parliamentary elections of 2012, a newly formed opposition coalition led by Bidzina Ivanishvili, a reclusive billionaire who had made his vast fortune in Russia, swept to power. In a rare display of democratic maturity for the region, Saakashvili accepted defeat and oversaw the first peaceful transfer of power in Georgia's modern history. When his presidential term officially ended in 2013, facing the very real threat of criminal prosecution by the new government, the man who had led the Rose Revolution quietly boarded a plane and fled the country he had tried so desperately to save. What followed was one of the most bizarre, theatrical, and deeply tragic second acts in modern political history. Unable to let go of his revolutionary identity, Saakashvili reinvented himself in Ukraine. Following the 2014 Maidan Revolution, the newly pro-Western Ukrainian government, desperate for experienced reformers, granted Saakashvili Ukrainian citizenship and appointed him as the governor of the notoriously corrupt Odessa region. But his volatile, uncompromising nature soon alienated his new allies. He engaged in highly public, explosive feuds with the Ukrainian president, leading to his dramatic dismissal, the stripping of his Ukrainian citizenship, and his literal physical expulsion from the country. He became a stateless wanderer, a geopolitical ghost haunting the fringes of Eastern Europe, giving speeches and plotting his return to relevance. That return arrived in October 2021, driven by a fatal miscalculation that mirrored his catastrophic gamble in August 2008. Believing that the Georgian people were ready to rise up and overthrow the government, Saakashvili smuggled himself back into Georgia, hiding in the back of an 18-wheeler truck hauling dairy products. It was a desperate, almost pathetic echo of the man who had once stormed the parliament with a rose. He was swiftly discovered, arrested, and thrown into a Georgian prison, charged with abuse of power during his presidency. Today, the images that occasionally emerge of Mikhail Saakashvili are deeply haunting. The vibrant, endlessly energetic leader who once stood shoulder to shoulder with American presidents is now a gaunt, sickly inmate confined to a prison hospital, exhibiting severe cognitive and physical decline. He claims he is being slowly poisoned. His captors claim he is manipulating his health for political sympathy. Regardless of the medical truth, his fate is a profound Shakespearean tragedy. The man who dedicated his life to pulling Georgia out of the Soviet shadow ended up a captive of the very state apparatus he helped modernize,
while the Russian threat he tried to extinguish looms larger than ever over his homeland. But the true legacy of Mikhail Saakashvili's doomed gamble extends far beyond the borders of the Caucasus. As we look back at those 5 days in August 2008, the historical parallels are not just striking, they are terrifyingly exact. Exactly 6 years after the tanks rolled through the Roki Tunnel, unmarked Russian soldiers, the infamous Little Green Men, fanned out across the Crimean Peninsula in Ukraine. Just as in Georgia, Moscow claimed it was merely protecting Russian-speaking citizens from a hostile, illegitimate, pro-Western government. Just as in Georgia, the operation was swift, asymmetric, and paralyzed the international community. And just as in Georgia, the West responded with profound caution, imposing mild sanctions but doing nothing to physically reverse the annexation. The successful playbook of 2008 was simply scaled up for 2014. And when Vladimir Putin launched the full-scale, devastating invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the ghosts of the August War were present on every battlefield. The cyber attacks that targeted Kyiv, the missile strikes on civilian infrastructure, the columns of armor pouring across the border, it was the ultimate, horrific manifestation of the military machine that was first unleashed upon Tbilisi. The tragedy of the modern era is that the world treated the Georgian War as a localized ethnic conflict, a minor speed bump on the road to global economic integration. Had the international community recognized the 5-day war for what it truly was, the violent, unmistakable announcement of a revanchist Russian empire determined to enforce its sphere of influence through bloodshed, the catastrophic horrors of Mariupol, Bucha, and Bakhmut might have been anticipated, mitigated, or perhaps even prevented. The story of the August War is a stark, unforgiving lesson in the brutal realities of geopolitics. It shatters the comforting illusion that shared democratic values and enthusiastic diplomatic rhetoric are sufficient shields against hard, kinetic military power. It teaches us that geography is often destiny, and that the choices made by great powers in the name of pragmatism carry a terrifying human cost for the smaller nations caught in their crosshairs. Mikhail Saakashvili looked at the post-Cold War world and believed that the sheer force of historical progress in Western idealism could outmaneuver the cold, calculating weight of Russian imperial ambition. He bet everything his country had on that belief. For 5 days in the summer of 2008, the world held its breath as that bet was called. And when the smoke finally cleared over the Caucasus Mountains, the chilling truth was revealed. In the unforgiving arena of global power, ideals can start a revolution, but only steel, blood, and the unwavering resolve of allies can defend a nation. The 5-day war may have been short, but its shockwaves continue to fracture our world today, a dark and permanent reminder of the price of defiance and the catastrophic cost of